This is the second session of our fifth seminar, and we're looking forward to hearing from Professor Stefano Rebeggiani to introduce our guest, Professor Giuseppe Pezzini of formerly St. Andrews and now Oxford University. So I'm going to stop this and pass over the floor to Professor Rebeggiani.
Thank you, David. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Giuseppe Pezzini from the University of St. Andrews, also known to his friends as Beppe. Professor Pezzini studied at the University of Pisa in Italy, the Scuola Normale Superiore. Then he moved on to the University of Oxford, where he got his PhD in classics, and and after that he had research positions first in Oxford, and then where he also worked as an assistant editor for the Oxford Dictionary of Medieval Latin. And then got a teaching position at St. Andrews, and will next year, is now on leave, and next year will take up a chair of Latin at Corpus Christi College, Oxford again. So he's moving back to Oxford to take up a professorship there. For us classicists, I was telling David before, Corpus Christi is this like a legendary place. It's where all the giants of Latin taught in the past. It's a little, if you allow me this soccer metaphor, it's a little like playing for Barcelona or Real Madrid if you're a soccer player, right? So Corpus Christi is Barcelona of Latin, and USC is like the LA Galaxy, like where the people who can't make it to the European League end up playing. And I'm super happy. I was so happy to know that Giuseppe got the position there. And it's got nothing to do with the fact that we're both Italian, that we studied together, and that he's also a good friend of mine. Giuseppe has been, his training was a linguist, as a linguist and a philologist, and that is initially, and that's reflected in his first book, which is a complex study of the way in which the verb to be works in Latin. But then later on, he's followed an interest in a great classics author that's very underrated, Terence, the author of comedy. And he has written a number of essays on Terence, and God knows if we need some more comedy during this time. And he's preparing a book, a commentary on Terence's Heauton Timorumenos, one of his most important plays. If you're not familiar with Terence, I invite you to reread it. Again, very underrated. It's both a master of dramatic art, but also uses comedy to explore the depths of human nature and reflect on how harmony can be created among human beings. On the side, Beppe has a number of essays on other modern authors, and now kind of started to an extent as a hobby, but it's become now a major book project on Tolkien, where he kind of takes seriously Tolkien and deploys his training as a philologist and a linguist to give us a vision of Tolkien, not just as to make justice to him as this great master of literature, and in particular with an attention to the subject of his book that's entitled The Mystery of Literary Creation. It's the aesthetic of literary creation, right? Tolkien's deeply unconventional and complex theory of the creative process and the relationship between reality and art, between creation and sub-creation. He'll tell us about it. In my view, this book and this essay take Tolkien's scholarship to a new level, just as me, but also I think it's not only for introduce me to this kind of unbelievably depth ideas that Tolkien had, deep, but also for me was an insight into also Tolkien's view of theological view, if you want, view of the ways in which the mystery writes our own history, right? Which the mystery intersects with our own life, which kind of gave me personal consolation. Sorry, I've been talking too much. I just want to remind you that we're going to have Professor Pezzini give us a presentation first, and then we'll open it up for questions. And without much further ado, over to you, Beppe.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone. I've been following from afar what you do in Nova Forum. I'm actually very envious of all of you. I think you're having a wonderful experience of learning, and it's a big honor for me to be speaking with you tonight. Sorry, tonight for me, I'm on the other side of the world. So for you, this morning for you. So I would like to share my handout straight away because I've got quite a rich handout. Let me just, okay. Can you just confirm that you see the handout? Is it big enough? Can you actually read? Do you want me to zoom in a bit? Wait, sorry, let me just hide sidebar. Do you see? Okay, perfect. Okay, so as you can see today, I'm going to talk about Tolkien. I'm going to talk about, I thank Stefano for his presentation. What I'm going to present to you is, if you want, the beginning of my book, the opening of my book. Of course, I've adjusted it a bit to make it into a paper, but it's, if you want, the premise. I gave you something to read, which are beautiful pages from in particular, from On Fairy Stories, where Tolkien gives this very beautiful overview of what fantasy is about and what is the purpose of a fantastic work. But today, in a way, before we get there, I make a step backward, and I start from the very beginning of Tolkien's artistic enterprise. And I would like to address a question, which is the question you find there, which is essentially the question about the nature and purpose of a Catholic imagination. This is really the question I'm going to address today. What does a Catholic artist, what does a Catholic writer do? What is he supposed to do? What is the origin, the nature, and the purpose of a Christian imagination? Why? How do we define it? Why we can say that something is Christian? And in this case of Tolkien, what does have a Christian experience to do with the creation of a fantastic world, which is the world of Middle-earth, a secondary world? We could really say a utopia in the etymological sense, a world that does not exist to a certain extent. And that Christian faith and the Catholic imagination and God in general has something to do, have all something to do with Tolkien, with the world of Middle-earth in general, I think is very difficult to deny. And Tolkien himself, as you can see there, described the Lord of the Rings as having been built on certain religious ideas, on a conflict about God, and in some, a fundamental religious and Catholic work. So Tolkien himself says, what I'm doing is to write Catholic literature. And following this sort of description of Tolkien, there have been many scholars in the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years who have tried to distill, we may say, the religious element out of the story. And in doing so, they have often approached the Lord of the Rings as a sort of a religious allegory, looking for symbolic meaning of events of characters, or reconstructing the moral or theological doctrine that supposedly informs the narrative. If this is a Catholic work, that means that there are some Catholic doctrine symbolically represented, hidden in this. But when we say that this is really the task and the blueprint of a Catholic imagination, so the Catholic writer, what the Catholic writer has to do is to transform some elements of his doctrine, of the Catholic doctrine, of the Catholic catechism, of the Catholic Church, of the theology, the Catholic theology, and then transform them and hide them into symbolic or allegorical tales and characters. Can we really say that this is what the Catholic imagination is about? And I'm pretty sure that Tolkien would have strongly objected to this idea. And we know this, for instance, from a very famous answer that Tolkien gave, which you can find here in the handout, to a reader of The Lord of the Rings who was wondering about what was the meaning and the purpose of his book. What is this book about? This is what Tolkien said, as you can say there, in a quite piquant letter to the New York Times. The Lord of the Rings is, to me anyway, largely an essay in linguistic aesthetic, as I sometimes say to people who ask me what it is all about. It is not about anything but itself. We can say, using a a word from the Oxford English Dictionary, we can say it's gratuitous, according to one of the definition, to be about anything about itself. It's self-referential, if you want. It's gratuitous. That's what Tolkien says. And of course, these words were not taken very seriously, and he himself lamented a few years later that nobody believes me when I say that my long book is an attempt to create a word in which a form of language agreeable to my personal aesthetic, and it's a personal aesthetic, might seem real, but it is true. So my aim of today is essentially to address this apparent paradox between the supposedly Catholic identity of Tolkien's work, which Tolkien himself recognized, and at the same time, his strong refusal to describe the Lord of the Rings as a Catholic allegory, a refusal which is related to this very strange claim about this self-referential, linguistic aesthetic, gratuitous nature of his work. We'll then explore, that's the second aim, the implication of this, we may say, aestheticist approach to artistic creation, to Catholic imagination, in order to shed light on Tolkien's vision about what is the nature and the purpose, indeed, of a Catholic literature, of a Catholic imagination. So that's where I'm going to start. And I'm going to start from number one on the handout, and I will begin, my journey will begin from a very important episode in Tolkien's early life, which took place during his university years in Oxford, and which can be considered as the foundation stone, as the, we may say, igniting spark of all Tolkien's mythology, the beginning of everything, if you want. And this has happened in 1914, where he was studying, he was supposed to study classics, but instead he was studying Anglo-Saxon in the spare time. And one day in the library, one of the Oxford libraries of his college, he came across a quite strange name from an ancient poem that he was reading in his library. And this name, this strange character, is this A.I. Rendell, a name that struck Tolkien, and it struck him not because of its meaning, because he didn't really understand what was the meaning, the semantics of the name, but it struck him because of his beauty, because of his aesthetic. And there is an unpublished work, posthumous work, which is called the Notion Club Papers, which you find here, in which Tolkien recalls that momentous encounter. Hail, Erendil, brightest of angels, above the middle earth, sent unto men. When I came across that citation in the dictionary, I felt a curious thrill, as if something had stirred in me, half wakened from sleep. There was something very remote and strange and beautiful behind those words, if I could grasp it, far beyond ancient English. I know more now, of course. The quotation came from the Christ, which is a 9th century poem in Anglo-Saxon, though exactly what the author meant is not so certain. In this passage, we can already highlight what are, in my view, the key features of Tolkien's creative method, of Tolkien's methodology of his imagination. And these include in particular this pure linguistic aesthetic appeal of the name, beautiful behind these words, also the uncertainty of the meaning. I don't know exactly what the meaning of this term was, and not even the author himself. We don't even know clear what the author meant with this. And also note the imagery that he's using to describe this experience. He was almost half awakened from sleep. So remember all these three things that I've said, because they will come back again and again in the course of my paper. So Tolkien referred to this seminal encounter many, many times in the rest of his life. I've chosen another quotation from a letter 297. The most important name of my mythology is Erendil. When first studying Anglo-Saxon professionally, I was struck by the great beauty of this word or name, euphonic to a peculiar degree. Again, we can see here that at the very beginning, because that's the very beginning of Tolkien's mythology, there is this key experience of being struck by beauty, which comes before anything else. And only later, as we're going to see, sets in motion an heuristic process. Tolkien is struck by the beauty of this name and begins a journey of heuristic, a journey of investigation, a journey of discovery. First of all, what is the meaning of this name? What does this name mean in the context of this poem? Tolkien was a professional philologist, so the first step of this heuristic, which began from this aesthetic encounter will be a scientific analysis of the term from a philological point of view, from a linguistical point of view, and I put you here all into one what is said about this. But for Tolkien, this scientific exegesis, and I will leave it aside for now, though it's interesting, but I will leave it aside for now, this scientific exegesis, this primary, meaning that it concerns the primary world, the real language spoken by the Anglo-Saxon, is just the very beginning of the heuristic. So Tolkien, we really see the artist coming out, does not simply try to give meaning to an aesthetic experience like the one we had with this name, but with by doing an etymology, a study. It does it also to a sort of, we may say, creative heuristic. What do I mean by that? I mean that in the very years, actually, in that just after a few weeks after this encounter, Tolkien began to write what was the very, very first poem of his mythology, which was indeed a poem about Erendil. And that's 2, 3 on the handout. And again, we can see here as the heuristic is not completed. We are just at the very beginning, because Tolkien gave the poem to read to a friend of his who was called G.B. Smith, who was studying a corpus of psychology indeed. And he gave it to his poem, and G.B. Smith read it and did not understand what the poem is about. And he said, what did you write about? I don't understand it. And he said, I don't really know what this poem is about, but I promise I'm going to find out. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that everything that followed from 1914 until 1973, so all the mythology that Tolkien developed for all his life, was the fulfillment of this promise to G.B. Smith. What was the meaning of that poem that he had written as an answer to an experience of aesthetic fascination? Because, and we're going moving to number 2-4 on the handout, this early poem, which is just the beginning of this very long journey of creativity, because it will then develop from this poem a full complex narrative, which eventually was epitomized in the etymology that he discovered. And I'm talking now about a secondary etymology, meaning what was the meaning of Erendil in Elvish, in Quenya, in the language of his characters, because that's how Tolkien's brain worked. To understand a meaning is not just the primary meaning, but the secondary meaning. What is the meaning of Erendil, who became a character of his legendarium within my own secondary work, that is in Elvish? And the etymology that he discovered in the end was Erendil as the lover of the sea. And this is iconic of who Erendil is, because Erendil is a character who is driven by a sea longing, and driven by this longing, by this if you want, Agostinian cor inquietum, he sails to the forbidden route, which leads from the fallen, hopeless Middle Earth, which you all know, to the lands of the gods, Valinor in the west. And there in the west, he implores the mercy of the gods, the Valar, and their intervention against the satanic Morgoth. And if you remember the story from the Silmarillion, after the mission of Erendil is accomplished, Erendil becomes the morning star, who is the bringer of hope to Middle-earth, just as in the Chris poem, but that's another story perhaps. And as the bringer of hope, which was his function also in the Anglo-Saxon poem, as the bringer of hope, will continue to play an important role in the Lord of the Rings. And if you remember, for instance, when Sam and Frodo see the star on the sky, in one of the darkest moments of the Lord of the Rings, that's Erendil. That's the Silmaril that Erendil is carrying on the mast of his ship, which is sailing on the sky. So what I've described so far with Erendil is just one case study within a vast sea of Tolkienian narratives, which should all of them trace back to this sort of serendipitous linguistic fascination, this very mysterious, a very self-referential, meaningless to a certain extent at the beginning, and only later explained and unfolded like a seed into a narrative. That's number 3 on the handout. So there are many examples where I could go on forever, okay? But all the characters of the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion can trace back at the beginning to this fascination for a beautiful word, a beautiful linguistic entity. But we can say that this pattern of composition, this very gratuitous aesthetic pattern of composition, applies on the macro level to the whole of Tolkien's literativity. As Tolkien says, number 3, it is a primary fact that it is fundamentally linguistic in inspiration. The invention of languages is the foundation. The stories were made rather to provide a word for the languages than the reverse. To me, a name comes first and the story follows. I once scribbled Hobbit on a blank page, and it was some time before I discovered, not again the word, what he referred to. So the second passage about, again, this strange beginning with a name that he does not know the meaning of, this passage which I've just read associates this linguistic practice of composition, what was for Tolkien the most momentous event of his literary career, which was the genesis of The Hobbit. As we have just read, this began as a sudden moment of inspiration, whose narrative implication and even semantic reference were only discovered later on. Of course, we could say that this is all authorial pretense, but there is plenty of textual philological evidence which suggests that Tolkien spoke in good faith. What I've done in my work, I've traced all the history, not all the history, but the history of the text of the Lord of the Rings. You can always see how at the beginning there is the same, a strange name which simply appeals the aesthetic imagination of Tolkien. So as you can imagine by now, I could go on for talking about Elvish languages and stories all the day, but I think I've already abused your patience on this. So I will now move to the second part of my paper, in which I will try, if you want, just as Tolkien did, to try to discover the meaning of what I've discussed so far, why this strange, odd methodology or creativity is so important. And the question they will certainly address is, how did Tolkien understand this particular creative experience, which, as we have seen, begins as an unplanned moment of aesthetic inspiration and normally a linguistic inspiration, is then expanded into a narrative item, and only later is developed into a full meaningful tale, all through a process of discovery, as we've seen. So what's the meaning of all this? That's how Tolkien worked, and we are pretty sure that that's what he did. But what kind of explanation did Tolkien give to his own way of creativity, his own way of doing art? And in order to address this question, I need to delve now into Tolkien's literary theory, which, since Tolkien was a committed Christian and a great thinker, is a theory which has close interrelation with his philosophical and theological views. I use the word theory, but let me stress that for Tolkien, we shouldn't speak about theory. I prefer to speak for Tolkien of a sort of theoretical self-reflection on a creative experience. First, there is the creative experience, the heuristic, and then there is the reflection, there is the theory. And that's basically exactly what happened also with Erendil. First, there is the experience of beauty, and then there is the explanation, not the other way around. And that's very important. So there are two key aspects in particular which caught the attention of Tolkien's self-reflective mind as regards his own way of creative inspiration. There are two qualities, and these are, I will say, first of all, it's being functionless, and second, it's being unconscious. What it does is functionless, does not have a function, and second, it is unconscious. What does that mean? Let's start with the first attribute. And I will describe the first attribute starting from one character of the Lord of the Rings, who is very important and who is very often misunderstood and neglected. And indeed, in the movies, he was cut out completely. And this is the character of Tom Bombadil, number 41 on the handout. And if you remember the presentation of Tom Bombadil in the book, Tom Bombadil is introduced in the relevant chapter as a quite funny character, a mix of he seems a bit like a child, but he's also said to be a quite old character. But what he does at the very beginning, what he does in a very iconic way, is to sing some apparent nonsense. Someone was singing a song, a deep gut voice was singing carelessly and happily, but he was singing nonsense. So what Tom Bombadil does, and he keeps doing it, this idea comes back again and again, is singing nonsense. Tom Bombadil sings in a language which does not have a clear meaning to the audience, and the audience are the Hobbit, who are the focalizers of the story. Focalizers, I mean that the story of the Lord of the Rings is written by the point of view of the Hobbits, so we see what's going on from their eyes, and this is very important. And this apparent nonsense of Tom Bombadil looks nonsense to the Hobbits. But in fact, Tolkien suggests that behind Tom Bombadil's nonsense, there is some deeper and ancient meaning behind what he's saying. And again, Tom sang almost all the time, but it was chiefly nonsense. Or, that's a very important qualification, or else perhaps a strange language unknown to the Hobbits, an ancient language whose words were mainly those of wonder and delight. So you see here, do you recall what Tolkien was saying about the first encounter with Eärendil? The world coming from a very ancient past. So the language of Tom Bombadil, which looks like nonsense to the Hobbits, is actually the language of coming from an ancient past. And behind these quite ambiguous words, and then moving to number 4.2, there is a very complex philosophy of language, which is at the basis of what Tolkien does, according to which the language of unfallen creatures, of Adamic creatures before the fall, reflected an original virginal, we may say, attitude towards reality. A reality in which there was a unity between the creatures and the creator, the divine and the human were together, an attitude to reality which was always approached with wonder, was always approached as something new. There was no separation in this ancient past between knowledge and affection, between the scientific and the artistic side, Tolkien says. And this virginal position, which is the position of human beings before the fall, corresponds in language to a perfect language. That is a language made of perfectly beautiful words, which featured a perfect harmony between sound, form, and meaning. I don't have the time now to dive into this theory, but what for me is very important is that Tom Bombadil, in a way, speaks this sort of language, speaks a language which belongs to this pre-fallen state of humanity. There are quite a few references to this linguistic theory scattered across Tolkien's works. I don't have the time to delve into this, but let me just say that Tom Bombadil embodies, as I was already mentioned, this virginal approach. And this is why Tom Bombadil is described as both the eldest and the child, because the eldest creatures were like children in their relationship with reality. The opposite of this naive approach to reality, which is an approach filled with love, it's an approach which can be said as a utilitarian approach, a functional approach, a possessive approach, which is, Tolkien says, exactly what Tolkien Bombadil lacks. You see, Tom Bombadil was unconcerned with doing anything with the knowledge. Tom Bombadil has an anti-utilitarian approach, and that's another feature which characterizes him as the eldest, as one of the pre-fallen creatures. From the linguistic, philosophical perspective, this anti-functionalistic approach to language of Tom Bombadil echoes Tolkien's own anti-functionalist approach, or at least we may say pre-functionalist approach to language. And that's something that he says quite often in his letters, and I read only one passage. I'm interested for the cutic aesthetic pleasure deriving from a language for its own sake. You see, again, the same idea of gratuitousness. It's a language does not have a function, not only free from being useful, but free even from being the vehicle of a literature, not to mention a theology, a philosophy, a doctrine, a message, an ethics, or whatever. That's not what Tolkien is interested in. Tolkien is interested in this very, if you want, pure, naive love for beauty on its own sake. And this sort of dichotomy between function on the one hand and love, functionlessness on the other hand, is applied by Tolkien more generally to art. number 4, 5 on the handout. You can see that very often in the letters we find on the one hand function and the other love. On the one side art and on the other side power. And of course power is a very important theme within the Lord of the Rings, and the dichotomy between art and power is central in the whole narrative of his novel. Tolkien is artistic. Tolkien does not like power and control, and power and control are categories which also apply to allegory, because allegory is a tool of control of the reader, is a tool of control of the people who read. Allegory is used by the writer to impose on the reader something that he thinks. That's not what Tolkien does. And that's why, as Tolkien says, The Lord of the Rings was simply a work of narrative art, of which the object aimed at by the author was just to be enjoyed as such, to be read with literary pleasure. So this rejection of a utilitarian conception of art, which is epitomized in this fascination for language, which we saw in the case of Arundel, I think it's quite similar to aestheticist position such as that of Oscar Wilde or Walter Pater, the late romantic aestheticist position. Ars gratia artis, I think it's a motto which can apply to a certain extent to Tolkien's creative endeavor. And I say to a certain extent because, and that's the paradox which I want to explore with you, this functionalness of art, this purposelessness of art does have, in fact, eventually, in the etymological sense, after the event, through an event, it does have eventually and expectedly a purpose. This functionalness, this aesthetic fascination is the starting point to be recovered again and again and again, but it's not the end of the journey. It's not the end of the creative journey, which is the journey which Tolkien, if you want, developed for his life throughout his creative work. It's a journey of recovery for the people, for those of you who have read now on Fairy Stories. I can introduce this notion, very important notion of recovery. It's a journey of recovery of meaning, recovery of a relationship with reality which is naive, like the one of Tom Bombadil, recovery of a desire for God, recovery for the passion for living and so on. But it's a journey which begins in a very gratuitous way. But to explain better what I mean by this, I need now to introduce the second key quality of Tolkien's self-reflective mind, which is the notion of unconsciousness, the quality of unconsciousness. Creation, and we may say the Catholic imagination, is unconscious to a certain degree. It's a gift. We're going to see what that means. And I'm now using the word invention, but let me highlight again that Tolkien uses the word invention in the etymological sense, from the Latin invenia, to find out. Invention for Tolkien is not an intentional intellectual pursuit. Rather, it's a creative process which is always unconscious, which is always transcends the intentions and the consciousness of the author, number 5.1 on the handout. And this idea is figuratively expressed in a work like The Lost Road, in which we find two characters from 20th century England who received a series of mysterious linguistic dreams, number 5.1 on the handout. Let me just read one passage. In the dreams, they came and went, but lately they had been getting more frequent and more absorbing, but still tantalizingly linguistic. No tale, no remember pictures, only fragments, and that's a very important word, fragments of words, sentences, and verses. This again, it's a sort of narrative of his own, of Tolkien's own creative process. We know that because the language that comes in this stream is Quenya, is Elvish, and is Adunaic. So in particular is the language of ancient Numenor. These two characters from 20th century England receive linguistic dreams about the stories of Numenor, and they write down the language they receive in the dreams without knowing the meaning at the beginning, just as in the case of Arundel, and only later they develop these linguistic dreams into images and narratives that eventually will turn out to be the story of Numenor, which is the content of the Amazon series of the Tolkien coming out with Amazon next year. According to Tolkien, the content of the Amazon series done by Jeff Bezos comes from these dreams, from these linguistic dreams sent to these two characters in this lost road. This fictional account, of course, is fictional, but reflects some key aspects of Tolkien's own experience, number 5.2, because he himself reveals that he had himself, just like Faramir in The Lord of the Rings, an archetypical dream about Numenor. And what he did by writing about it was a sort of, if you want, almost psychoanalysis of attempt to exorcise the dreams that he was having. So again, for Tolkien, it's not just language, but also storytelling, which originate from dreams. Dreams are at the beginning, and dreams, of course, are the symbol of something which comes in the unconscious. It does not come from an intentional strategy of the author. And of course, for the people who have read Tolkien's works, dreams are very present also in The Lord of the Rings and in general in the Legendarium. So I've given a few examples. For instance, in the book of Lost Tales, which is the first draft of the Silmarillion, we find a character who is called Ariel, who means the one who dreams alone, who receives dreams about the ancient story of the elves. And these dreams have an artistic, musical nature. You see, they have to do with music. They are musical dreams. And starting from these musical dreams, Ariel will develop the narrative that many decades later will be transformed into the Silmarillion. So you see that there is a clear interconnection between dreams and imagination and art in general. And that's a leitmotif in Tolkien's works. And I'll give you again, I don't know if you remember the proper name, the real name of Gandalf. Gandalf is Olorin, who is the one who sends vision, who sends fantasies, who sends dreams, you see. And it's interesting the way these dreams sent by Gandalf are described. These are construction having solely an artistic object, that is not having the object of deception or of acquiring power. You see the same dichotomy between power on the one hand and art on the other hand. And the dreams that the characters receive, that Tolkien himself receive, have to do with art, not with power. And even the writing of The Lord of the Rings, according to Tolkien, is something which goes on when sleeping. Again, this idea that there is never, we're not dealing with a plan, an intentional strategy of the author. It's an experience, a mysterious experience of something coming from very far away. This idea of unconsciousness does not just apply to the very beginning, the language, Erendil, the linguistic dreams of the Numenor, but can be found all across the different stages of the creative process. I put you here now on number 46 on the handout, a list of quotes, which of course I don't have the time to read, but you see that in each of them we find the word unconscious, is non-conscious, everything is unconscious. You see, that's Tolkien hammers on this point, down to the level of the message. As for message, I have none really. You see, there is no message in The Lord of the Rings, meaning there is no conscious purpose in writing The Lord of the Rings, of preaching or of delivering myself of a vision of truth specially revealed to me. I was primarily writing an exciting story in an atmosphere and background as I find personal attractive. That's what The Lord of the Rings is about. It's not about a Christian message. That's not what the Catholic imagination is supposed to do according to Tolkien. And even the Christian content, as I'm going to say better later on, is something which comes unexpectedly. The Christian figuration, if you want, is not given by the author. It is something which is given as a gift by someone else. The connection between The Lord of the Rings and the gospel story, and again, I'm now referring to Unfairy Stories, it's a gift. It's a gift of the Holy Spirit. It's a gift of gratia. It's a gift of grace. It's not the producer, the producer, the intention of the author. So this very last quote, with this emphasis on the absence of a message, brings back to what I was saying at the very beginning about language, about Erendil. There is no meaning in Erendil. Tolkien does not have a clear meaning. So you see that by going down to the Christian message, we can connect all these different stages, all these different creative stages into a single framework. because that's what I find very interesting. All these different creative stages, which are listed in number 5, 6, from, again, the invention of names, but the invention of characters, the development of the narrative, the development of all the different threads of the story, the Christian's maze, everything is unconscious. And all this, since everything is unconscious, everything is interconnected. All these different stages of the creative work are, we may say, chained together in a hierarchical order, which ultimately, as we have seen, can be traced back to a moment of linguistic fascination, as the encounter with Erendil. So we can see here how for Tolkien, what Tolkien is doing is truly an aesthetic research. It's truly a journey of aesthetic research from the very beginning down to the very end. All the different stages of the composition are, if you want, derived from an attempt to go deeper into an aesthetic fascination. So I meet first the name Erendil. I want to understand what's the meaning of Erendil. So I start writing a poem about it, but there is something missing. So I'm going to develop more. I'm going to create a world, and so forth and so forth. One stage to the other is led by this, if you will, love for beauty, love for pleasure, almost an even hedonistic sense of the meaning of aesthetic research. It's a chain, it's an adventure which proceeds according to different stages. And in the passage which you find here, I very much like the way Tolkien talks about the different stage. And he said that at this different stage, there is a pleasure of contemplation. At each stage, the writer, the artist contemplates what he's doing, but the contemplation for Tolkien is not static. It's a restless contemplation. It's a dynamism. It's a dynamic contemplation that urges the artist to go forward in the creative journey. And that's how we can see all the different rings of the chains are connected, because the contemplative gaze of the artist, which is an aestheticist gaze, however, never stops on a particular frame, never stops on a particular stage, but driven by an aesthetic urge, widens into discovering more and more about the context and the origin of the original fascination. And just to make you understand that I'm not making it up, I will read a very beautiful passage from the little short story Leaf by an Eagle, in which we see a very clear, although symbolic, description of what is this creative process according to Tolkien. He used to spend a long time on a single leaf, trying to catch its shape and its sheen and the glistening of dewdrops on its edges. So you see the love for the detail, the aesthetic obsession for the detail. Yet he wanted to paint a whole tree with all of its leaves in the same style and all of them different. And there was one picture in particular which bothered him. He had begun with a leaf caught in the wind, and then it became a tree, and the tree grew, sending out innumerable branches and thrusting out the most fantastic roots. Then all around the tree and behind it, through the gaps in the leaves and boughs, a country began to open up. And there were glimpses of a forest marching over the land, and of mountains tipped with snow. So you see, we start from the leaf, from the detail of the leaf, and we go to the mountains. That's basically what the Catholic imagination is about for Tolkien. What is for me very important is that each step of this artistic composition is singular, is self-referential, is functionless, and needs to be so in order to produce that gratuitous beauty which urges the artist to proceed to the following stage. It's the love for the functionlessness, for the gratuitousness of beauty, which urges the artist to move on. And this is why the deeper meaning, like the meaning of the word Erendil, is only discovered eventually, after the aesthetic event. Eventually, let me say it again, in the etymological sense. What is, I think, clear to you is that the reason why Tolkien talks a lot about dreaming, associate dreamings and imagination, is really to highlight this idea of unconsciousness. But what, and then we go to the third and final part of my paper, what is, however, very interesting is that this sort of dream that Tolkien talks about is never a personal dream. And as you can see here, the dream that, as Tolkien says, the master of the critics, in fairy and drama, so in what he's doing in fantastic literature, the dreams that arrive to the artist are dreams that some other mind is weaving. And that makes the difference between Tolkien and, if you want, most of the psychoanalysis of the 20th century. The dreams do not come from the subconscious, if you want. They come from somewhere else. For Tolkien, the artistic event is an inspiration in the etymological sense, is an echo of some other voice, this strange dream that some other mind is weaving. And this idea that dreams, the artistic dreams, are something other, the otherness of artistic dream is omnipresent in Tolkien. I could go on forever and ever about this. If you've read the Silmarillion, especially the early drafts of the Silmarillion, a lot of characters receive artistic dreams that are sent by the Valar, you see. Again, I don't have time, and let me just focus on one example of the Lord of the Rings, if you remember, which is the 107.2, and that's the beautiful passage in the Shelof's lair. You say, Galadriel, he said faintly, and he heard voices far off but clear. The crying of the elves as they walked under the star in the beloved shadows of the Shire, and the music of the elves as they came through his sleep in the hall of fire in the house of Elrond. Gilthoniel or Albereth. And then his tongue was loosed and his voice beguiled in a language which he did not know. And then he starts to sing a song in Elvish. That's a very important passage in The Lord of the Rings. We have a character, Sam, who does not know Elvish, who starts singing, and he's singing with this, in a passage which is marked by this imagery of this dreaming, of being half asleep, you see, while he was half asleep in the Hall of Fire. And this sets in motion a creative event, an artistic event, which will also bring hope to the characters and hope to the story. We see in this passage all the elements I've discussed so far. The sudden origin of a linguistic inspiration, which is meaningless at the beginning, the dreamlike imagery through his sleep, the otherness, he heard voices far off, as well also all this meta-artistic implication. It's the music of the elves. It's a musical dream, the one he was receiving in this very passage. Again, I don't have time, but this association between dreaming and music is omnipresent. So you see, if you have time, I will send you the handout. You find it everywhere in The Lord of the Rings. Whenever there is a dream, you see, there is always joy, and there is always the beginning of some sort of creative event. But the question remains, where does this voice come from? What is the source of this inspiration? Who is weaving the dream? In The Lord of the Rings, we know it. They are the Valar. The Valar are the ones sending the dreams, like the dream of Boromir and Faramir at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. It's very clear that comes from the Valar. We know it. And the more we go back in the early drafts of the Silmarillion, this is said in a very explicit way. The whole world, in fact, is a dream of the Valar, according to the Silmarillion. But what about the primary world? Where does Tolkien's artistic dreams come from? Tolkien never actually says it in open terms, and that's something which is very typical of his own creative personality. And yet, I do think he suggested. And we read this in this passage where he says that the Holy Spirit seems sometimes to speak through a human mouth, providing art, virtue, and insight it does not himself possess. So it's quite clear that for Tolkien, inspiration is a divine inspiration, and this is very clear also in the Silmarillion. It's very clear in the Legendarium in general. As already mentioned, the Valar are the divine beings, Valar are the ones sending the dreams. There is one Valar in particular, who is the Valar Ulmo, the Valar of water, who sends a lot of different dreams. As we know it, you see the dream of Ulmo is water. Water for the most part, the dream and invention of Ulmo. And Ainu, whom Ilúvatar is struck deeper than all the other in the depths of music. This is very beautiful because the idea for Tolkien is that Ulmo sends dreams, but the way he sends dreams is through reality, through elements of reality. Reality, Arda, is this group of dreams of the Valar that are sent by the Valar for the benefit of the creatures of Middle-earth. This is the whole vision of the Anulindale, which is the opening of the Silmarillion. You remember, this is a cosmogonic myth of creation, where we have this concert of the Ainur. And this myth, read again, is a myth which has very clear meta-artistic implication. And if we focus for a moment on this myth, we see everything that I've said so far embodied in a figurative way. And indeed, we see in this myth that the musical composition of the Valar have at the beginning no purpose beyond its own beauty. They are gratuitous. The Valar don't know what they are doing. They are just singing for the beauty of it, to please the ear of Ilúvatar. They also say that this Ard appears first as a vision, and also he appears as in a fashion as one will perceive a story composed by someone else. Even the Valar themselves, when they create art, which is Arda, they do it, but they do it as if they were doing, as if they were, if you were molding a story given to them by someone else. And also, just for even for the Valar, the meaning of what they are doing, the meaning of Arda, is only discovered at the very end of it, and fully only at the very end of Arda. You need the whole history of Arda, from the very beginning to the very end, for the Valar, who are the ones who are doing it, to understand their meaning. And it's the same with the creative work. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings, but did not understand the meaning of what he was doing. It took him the whole life and beyond his life to understand everything that was there, because there was something coming from outside. And then finally, again, if we focus on this myth, which I don't have time to delve too much, but it is said very clearly that the artistic, the creative talent of the Valar derives specifically from the gift of the Holy Spirit, of the flame imperishable, the imperishable flame, which has been bestowed to them. Only through the bestowal of the secret fire they can create art. And what lies behind this is, of course, the doctrine of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. I will say specifically of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, but I'm not a theologian, so I will not go into this direction. But for me, it's enough to say that for Tolkien, imagination is not an intellectual project, but is a gratuitous inspiration of the Holy Spirit, which must be accepted and embraced, and eventually at the end of the creative event, recognized as a gift. And this is, in fact, what Nigel in the story says at the site of the completed tree. It's a gift. And we also know through a letter, to an unpublished letter, that's what Tolkien said himself when he first had the first proofs of the Lord of the Rings. It's a gift. Anyway, I think there will be time to speak more about all this, but there is still at least a question which I need to address. If you bear with me for another 5 minutes, I know I'm going 5-10 minutes. I know I've been a bit too long, but if you have 5-10 minutes to go, I will like to conclude with a final question, which I think it needs to be addressed. And the question is what it is all about, as we were saying at the very beginning. So we have seen that for Tolkien, it's all about an artistic, gratuitous act. It's all about this dynamic contemplation, which leads, pushes, urges the artistic subject into a journey. And only at the end of it, the meaning will gratuitously emerge. That's what art is about. But why is that? What it is all about? What's the point of art? What is the meaning, the function, the message of Tolkien's creative project? And again, to answer this question and then really go to the conclusion, move to the conclusion, I will go back to Eärendil again, and especially I will zoom back on the etymology of the name of Eärendil. Eärendil, as you remember, is the lover of the sea. That's what Tolkien says the name means. And again, Eärendil is a restless character, is an Augustinian character, if you want, in the Silmarillion. He's struck by this longing for the sea, which comes from water, because water is the place where the music of the Ainurs plays, is where the characters listen to the dream of Ulmo. So he is enamored with the voices of the sea, and then is compelled, as we were saying before, to drive west. And if you remember, to reopen a route from the world of the gods to the world of Middle-earth. So it's quite clear that what Eärendil does is exactly this, to reform a connection, to open a way from the fallen world that we are living, that Tolkien was living, to the world of God on the other side of the ocean. What is, however, quite interesting is that this desire of Eärendil, which will be crucial because it will be the one that will bring back the Valar to Middle-earth and will reopen the way from Middle-earth to Valinor. All this sea longing, this desire, is inspired by the Valar themselves. It does not come from Erendil. It's not that Erendil is particularly intelligent. No, Erendil has been chosen as the recipient of dreams, indeed, of Ulmo, and through these dreams, inspired by the Valar, Erendil will eventually reopen a way to the gods. So you see how Erendil embodies this very important idea that we find in the whole of Tolkien's works, which is the idea that the whole of creation, Tolkien talks especially about water, about water because water is the element of Ulmo, as we were saying before, but all the creation is the place, is the way in which God and through the Valar bring back the human heart to them. The whole of creation, the whole beauty of creation, that's what the Arda is about, that's what the artistic creation of the Valar is about, is just a means to put again characters like Erendil on the journey that leads to the West. That's basically what everything is all about. And if you remember the Lord of the Rings, all the characters in the end will leave Middle-earth and go west. And what Gandalf does for the whole of the Rings is to reawaken the desire of the characters. It's a desire of the high, Tolkien says in a beautiful letter, which will brought into completion eventually with a departure into the West. This also explains why Erendil is also the bringer of hope. It's not just the sea lover, but it's also the bringer of hope, because since he has been given a dream, this very, very dream, which does not come from his own mind, but is woven by someone else, is the proof that the god, the Valar, are still looking after Middle-earth. So we can see how the whole point of Erendil is to reawaken the sea longing, which again and again in Tolkien takes place always in connection with a dream. And if you remember the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, Frodo decides to leave the Shire only after a dream that he has, if you remember. Anyway, I think it's very, very late, so I will skip a bit, but let me just finish with my conclusions to try to wrap up everything. And I will move now to point number 10. We have seen Erendil at the very beginning of Tolkien's creative work. And who is Erendil? Erendil is the one who has been given the dream, who has been given a sea longing to sail west and reopen a way to the god. And the place where this happens is the reality, and especially water, if you want. But what has all this to do with artistic creation? What has all this to do with art? Why the journey of Erendil is artistic? What has this to do with art? So in conclusion, let me remind you, first of all, that the water, which is what drives Erendil to leave Middle-earth, therefore to start sailing again on the road that leads to the mystery, is the musical dream of Ulmo, and it's itself an echo of the original music inspired by the Holy Spirit. But to be even more explicit, we may say that the reawakening of sea longing is possible only through the encounter with the gratuitous beauty of the artistic creation. And this is what Arda is. That's what water is. Only a gratuitous artistic creation can truly reawaken the sea longing and the desire. It's the water, the creation of Ulmo and Ilúvatar, which compels the restless Erendil, but also the poetic creation, the poem Christ, read by Tolkien when he was a young boy, that led him first to engage into everything that he did later on. If you think about the Lord of the Rings, it's only through listening to the music of the elves that characters like Bilbo and Frodo decide to travel. All these different artistic creations, from Christ to Arda to the Lord of the Rings and whatever, are all connected. And they are connected first because the encounter with this artistic entity on any plane urges the recipients to create new beauty, new art. So there is really a chain which starts with God at the very beginning, which creates gratuitous beauty, And the more you stay in front of gratuitous beauty, the more you want to create new beauty. And so the chain goes on and on and on and on. God, according to Tolkien, continues his creation through the artist, and especially to the Christian artist. And the reason for doing that is to reawaken again and again the desire for him. By, Tolkien says in the Fairy Stories that you have read, by cleaning the windows, cleaning the eyes. But there is one important element which connects all different artistic creation, the trademark, if you want, of creation, which is, as we have seen today, gratuitousness. Gratuitousness is the trademark of inspired beauty, of inspired art, is the trademark of God, who creates beauty for its own sake only, and thereby, Tolkien says, to be contemplated and enjoyed by his creatures. This is a very beautiful letter. They exist. God creates reality just for itself because he loves creating. It's an act of mercy, it's an act of love. But since they have a function which is to be contemplated by us. It's a paradox. It's this paradox of contemplative beauty. If you do create gratuitous beauty, it will be contemplated because it is gratuitous. And in fact, those who let themselves be wounded by gratuitous beauty cannot but develop within themselves this insatiable longing for its divine origin, just like Erendil. And while becoming themselves artists of new beauty, like Tolkien, continue to reawaken still longing in other people, including us, the readers of The Lord of the Rings. In sum, that's really the end. Artistic creations of any planes, including The Lord of the Rings, have the sole meaning and purpose to create new, purposeless, functionless, gratuitous beauty, and thereby to collaborate with creation. And in fact, Tolkien says the whole point of fantasy is to, fundamental function is to offer a tribute to the infinity of God's potential variety, to exhibit the variety of God's creative power. This is the task of the Catholic imagination, according to Tolkien, to give this tribute to the God's gratuitous creative variety. It's not about translating doctrines into allegories, but by creating new, gratuitous, functionless beauty. A beauty which stands against, as a challenge, we can say, as a challenge against the modern world, the world of Tolkien, which was darkened by two great works, where everything was and is useful, functional, and thus violent. All artistic creations are self-referential. They are about themselves, like The Lord of the Rings, and need to be so, because it is only through this divine inspired gratuitousness that they can hope to attract fallen creatures to travel back, to start back a journey, to start walking again on the path which eventually leads to the discovery of meaning, to the recovery of meaning, and the related recognition of a creator. So the true purpose of a Catholic imagination is to help recovery of a true relationship with reality, and therefore of a recognition of a creator. But they do so exactly in the same way as primary creation, the artistic word of God, does, by offering in a very merciful way new beauty. This all seems very paradoxical, of course, but this is the paradox of divine beauty, which for Tolkien is another facet of the paradox of mercy. As you can see this in this beautiful letter, when it talks about a moment of decision of Frodo to spare the God of the Ring, Tolkien says this is an exercise of mercy, of extravagant generosity, done without any conscious purpose. And for that very reason, because it was done without a conscious purpose, because it was gratuitous, that it was rewarded at the end by the victory of the Lord of the Rings, that is the extravagant generosity of God. So just as human mercy, purposeless yet meaningful, is analogous to the mercy of God, so the aesthetic generosity of an inspired human creation, of an inspired art, is a reflection of the original gratuitous generosity of the primary creation of God, who, as we know, make his sun to rise on the evil and on the good. And really the conclusion, thanks for your patience, I will say that to reawaken the desire for God, for the sake of a fallen world, is perhaps the true purpose of the Lord of the Rings. But this purpose, which is the purpose, if you want, of a Catholic imagination, is accomplished only because the book was not originally written with that in mind and did not involve any conscious intellectual purpose of any kind. It was, as we heard, an essay linguistic aesthetic. It was about itself. It began with an aesthetic fascination for a word in a 9th century poem. And because of all this aesthetic gratuitousness, inspired and analogous to that of God, it has been able to reawaken, however confusedly, the longing for the sea, the desire to walk again on the path that leads to meaning, and the prophetic hope that all this contains. Thank you very much. Sorry, it's been longer. Thanks for your patience. And please, very happy to have a bit of Q&A.
I can see Father Luke first, and then Anne-Marie.
Actually, that was just an applause statement, a congratulations again for a very beautiful, wonderful presentation. Thank you.
So then I guess Victor's first, and then Audrey.
Thank you. I'm very interested about this contempt of Tolkien towards allegory. And I wonder if he ever recriminated C.S. Lewis for using fantasy in such allegorical ways.
Yes, it does. As we know, it does. It does, and it keeps saying that it dislikes very much Lewis literature for this very reason. This is a very big topic to discuss, but I think with due respect, it's the whole difference between a Catholic and non-Catholic position in a sense. So for Tolkien, the Catholic, the singular artistic beauty, the story for its own sake has a value. For C.S. Lewis, again, it's much more complex than that. Okay, so I'm saying this with full knowledge and awareness of the simplification. Priority, if you want, is given to the philosophy. The literature, in a way, is always a vehicle for something else. And in a way, it played a very important function, if you want. Okay, so I'm not saying that this is bad, but for Tolkien, literature is not a vehicle, is an end in itself. It's not a way to express something different. It's completely self-referential. And it's only through this self-referentiality which can say something very interesting. Whereas for C.S. Lewis, I think Tolkien will say it, philosophy will come first, and philosophically speaking, Lewis and Tolkien agreed on everything, if you want. I think that Tolkien and Lewis, and Tolkien himself said it, will have very little to disagree on. And yet, I think they will disagree only on this thing, on this complete love, this pure love that Tolkien had for literature, which I think is very Catholic in the sense it has to do with the idea that story, that creation of any plane, of any kind, has a value, as if you want a metaphysical value. There is not a single detail in the whole creation of God, from the very beginning down to the creation of a little child when he draws on, that does not have a value, is not connected. Tolkien, if you remember the beautiful discussion that Tolkien had with Lewis doing a work on Modern College about the ontological status of stories, we may say. And Lewis said, stories are not real, they are lies. I mean, they're beautiful, they have a function, but they are lies. And Tolkien said, not at all, the stories are true. And Tolkien talks about the truth of the story all around in his works, in his letters. The truth of the stories, of his own stories, has to do with the ontological status of the stories. And I do think all these have as a connection with what I've been trying to say today, because a true story which is done purely for the sake of affirming gratuitous beauty becomes also true, is also true, has also some elements of truth, because as we know from Aquinas, beauty is the splendor of truth. So it's not possible to have true beauty without truth. So even it's not the end of it, okay? The aestheticist movement is not the end of the journey, but it's the beginning of it. And I do think that C.S. Lewis will have different views on it. And even the way C.S. Lewis talks about his own creative journey in Pelelandra or in Narnia, yes, I mean, he does talk about the fact that it does not come out intentionally with stories, but he always comes with the idea that stories are there to express some sort of meaning. There is always this sort of philosophical concern, which Tolkien simply does not have.
Okay, there was, thanks Beppe, there was, I have Audrey, Ben, and then Professor Albertson, and then Jason Blakely.
Oh, hello. I really enjoyed listening to your talk as I recently read The Silmarillion this summer, which is probably the only time I'll have the time to get through a book like that. But I did find it very interesting reading about how what Tolkien was trying to do with his book. Because when I'd read The Silmarillion and The Lord of the Rings, I very much saw it as similar to like the Chronicles of Narnia, where it's like, it feels like it's very much an allegory, like very much so as if I read it and interpreted it as if the author were trying to clearly like parallel the two. And so I was wondering, because I'd heard, I'm not sure how well I interpreted it now because I don't know. I'm confused because as an author, it feels like you're always in the act of balancing, trying to put a message in there that's communicating what you want to communicate so that your reader can understand it, but not make it so blunt and obvious that it's insulting their intelligence. But it's a very different idea for me to think about just creating something just as a creative outpouring of what somebody else gave you.
I know it's very different. It's very different for me as well. So even when I write myself, I find it very difficult. But that's what Tolkien did. And especially the Silmarillion, you have to imagine, Audrey, that Silmarillion was considered as a purely private enterprise. He called it very often in his own nonsense. So for many, many years, he just did it for himself. And he did it, as he himself said in his letter, to rationalize the trauma he had in the First World War. It was something he did only for himself. It was the way he was trying to express his own experience of the hell that he saw in the First World War. And it's only with time that he started to discover that actually his own private vice was something given for the good of everyone. And the turning point was The Hobbit. So it's only with The Hobbit that Tolkien began to understand that actually what he was doing had a purpose. He had to be offered to everyone else. But he was certainly not there at the very beginning. And now it's betting on gratuitousness, if you want. It's betting on the idea that a pure act of gratuitousness has a meaning on itself. And in order to do that, you need to have a great faith, if you want. But at the end, you will be rewarded, just like Frodo was rewarded at the end of The Lord of the Rings.
I have Ben, and then Professor Blakely, and then Professor Albertson. Ben, over to you.
Please ignore, I can't, and my question is not formatted in my head yet, so give me time, sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. Fantastic. Tolkien was kind of my first literary love when I read him in grade school, and I wasn't even Catholic, and my dad, who wasn't Catholic, would read him to me by the fire. One thing that struck me about what you're saying that's pretty profound is this whole notion that art as kind of play for itself versus art as kind of propaganda. I think it's George Orwell's famous statement, all art is propaganda. By the way, I've always disliked Lewis. I've always thought he was mediocre. Sorry, I know he's very popular in Christian circles, so I agree with Tolkien there. Because he thinks of art as propagandistic or as a vehicle, he's too didactic, and thereby he's not a good artist, in my opinion. But what I wanted to ask you about is we've been reflecting on political theologies, and one thing that really struck me about Lord of the Rings is this fellowship. A lot of people have commented on it, you know, in an allegorical sense that Tolkien might reject as these disciples almost. But to put it more in the terms you're putting it, there are people who make friendship for its own sake, like Sam and Frodo. And then there are the people who instrumentalize each other and try to get power out of each other. And one of the reasons the hobbits are capable of carrying the ring is they're kind of childlike, they're simple, they're humble. and they are okay just being together. One of the most striking lines in the whole book is at the very end when Sam and Fred are together, and Sam just says, "It's good to be with you here at the end of all things." I mean, that line has always stayed with me, even though I have not reread the book since I was in grade school. And I'm wondering if you might say something about that fellowship. It seems to me like there's an analogous thing here between, it was very interesting, the letter you had us read, magic defined as sort of a machine or as a manipulation for Tolkien. And maybe they're like machine-like relationships, they're magic-like relationships. And in The Lord of the Rings, the evil people are the people who try to manipulate, control, or even just use each other's instruments. Whereas the people who have a fellowship, they have a friendship, paradoxically, don't try to get anything out of it. It's just there for its own sake. I don't know if you have something to say about that.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for the question. Again, this is very deep. I will try to answer the question starting from Sam. Who is Sam Gamgee? Sam Gamgee is a gardener. And what does a gardener do? A gardener is someone who is given some seeds, and then he takes the seeds and puts them under the ground. And then what he does is simply if he is a good gardener, not the kind of OMG gardener we have nowadays, but if he's a good gardener, he just allows the inner powers of the seeds to flourish. So the gardener has a respect for the seed, has a respect for otherness. And even when if he helps the seed to develop, he's respecting otherness. He's respecting something which is there. And now I move from Sam to the very beginning to an Anulindale, Morgoth, and so on. And that's the same dynamics. The problem with Morgoth, that Morgoth does not accept otherness. It does not accept there is something other than what he's doing. So the issue of otherness, the relationship with otherness, and of course the theme of fellowship and friendship is a way in which this is addressed, is key in the whole of Tolkien. And is also very important meta-artistic implications, because the true artist is like a gardener for Tolkien. The true artist is someone who is a friend with his own work. He's a friend with his own characters, meaning that he does not manipulate his characters to make them do what he wants to do. He discovers his characters on the way. And if you read the textual story of The Lord of the Rings, you really see that Tolkien meets his characters on the way. At the beginning, he does not know, for instance, who Aragorn is. He thought that Aragorn was a hobbit, and then Aragorn turned up to be this great king from the ancient past. And so and of course, what you said is very true. The friendship of the hobbits, friendship is a form of the respect of otherness, because it's a love is a form of respect of otherness, because you respect that there is someone who is out there, who is not there to be a pawn in your, to use the other image used by Gandalf and Saruman when they argue. It's not a pawn in your own vision, in your own project, your own plan. And to understand the friendship, yes, I do think the friendship between the hobbits is very telling, but I also think it's very important, the friendship between Gandalf and the hobbits, because Gandalf is this divine being who knows everything, almost everything, and knows very well that he should take the hobbits and kick their butts and move and get them going because they are a bit lazy and so on. But he never does it. He always respects their freedom. He's always friend with them. And think about Moria. To get into Moria, you need to say friend and enter. There is, for the very beginning of Moria, a statement of friendship. Gandalf enters the Moria, which is going to be his grave, by saying friends. And what he does in Moria, that is to die, to sacrifice himself, is completely crazy, because he's the one who really can save the whole thing. And to kill himself, to sacrifice himself to save the hobbits and the other characters, is completely stupid from the point of view of the world. So you see, why does he do it? Again, for an act of friendship to his friends. But so at the root of friendship, there is something very deep, which is, I do think has to do with the relationship between every one of us and reality. Reality is something other than us. And that's why Frodo is asked by Gandalf to spare Gollum, because Gollum is otherness. And therefore is not the one to choose whether he is supposed to die or live. So yes, thanks for the question. But you see how from friendship we move to everything, because that's what the Lord of the Rings is about. That's what the ring is about. The ring is about power, as we know.
David, you're muted.
I'll ask my question and then maybe we should wrap up. That's an impolite thing to do in a seminar, but I'll state that. But I wanted to get at Tolkien's Catholic identity a little bit different way, and I was struck by. I mean, thank you for this, remarkable presentation. But just to get to the point, you said these two functions, these two aspects of his aesthetic, functionlessness, and that it comes out of the unconscious. And I couldn't help but think it does come out of his unconscious, but we know, I mean, at least from one important kind of materialist perspective, it comes out of his unconsciousness, and he's been formed in certain networks of language, obviously in his own life. And that's another way to talk about the liturgical formation of Tolkien's imagination in his Catholic identity. So it doesn't come through allegorically necessarily, but it comes through in ways that might surprise him or be outside of his conscious control, but it's there in some way. In the same way, the functionlessness sounds like a language of praise. It has no functional purpose, but it's, we might say, doxological. Do you think that is that a good road to go down to think about his Catholic identity, or is that kind of getting us back toward Lewis? Yeah.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, partly yes. So Tolkien certainly says explicitly that, of course, his Christian identity played a big part he says, I mean, that of course, my Catholic ideas will be unconsciously imbued in my work. But the kind of unconsciousness I'm talking about there is deeper than that. And we know that because Tolkien himself makes this division, okay? So on the one hand, there is, if you want, yes, all the apparatus, from the historicist point of view, the culture where he grows up and so on, the doctrine and so on. But there is always something which goes beyond that. And that's why he says that the dream is woven by someone else. This otherness of the dreams for me is very key. And that's what distinguishes him, for instance, from a Lacan or from a Freud and so on. Tolkien is Newmanian, so it's not black and white, okay? So yes, there is an element of historicism in the way Tolkien understands about himself. But I do think here we are really touching about what is a Christian identity, what is a Catholic identity. So Catholic identity for Tolkien is not about the catechism, it's not about the doctrine, it's not about even the culture where you've been growing. It's not about the Catholic culture. The Catholic identity has to do with one's own personal lived experience and relationship with God. It's something that has to do in the present. It's a relationship. That's what the Catholic identity is about. And since it's a relationship with someone else, the inspiration deep down comes from that someone else. So to go down your route, David, which I'm not saying it's not wrong, but it risks to become a very historicist. And Tolkien will object to that, okay? Because Tolkien was a man of faith, and Tolkien knew that God is alive, and God is present, and God communicates to the angels. He was obsessed with angels, and through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. That's why, at the end, deep down, this unconsciousness is not just the subconscious in Lacanian or Freudian terms, okay? If it's more subconscious in the medieval terms, of the medieval mystics, of the great mystics of the 15th and 16th century, that even go to bed with God, if you're a son of these beautiful treatises, okay? The sense of the relationship, the reality of the relationship with God for the mystics of the Middle Ages was very, very, very real. And that's why the title of my book is The Mystery of Literary Creation. It's a mystic experience. It's not just an historicist one, which I think, again, distinguishes Tolkien from Lewis.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I totally agree. Thank you for helping me clarify that.
David,
there are a lot of other questions in the right. So do you want me to address them, or as you wish?
I also have a question, but I want to leave space to others. If we have time for one more question and someone else wants to ask a question. If not, I'll use the time selfishly in very...
Yeah, Stefano, go ahead and pose your question and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, thanks, David.
And sorry, before Stefano, because there's a question by Father Luke, which I really want to address because it's too nice, which says, is nonsense language a veiled expression of deeper meaning and value, or celebration of meaningless and deconstruction? I prefer Bombadil to Derrida. And we may say Bombadil to James Joyce, because this kind of issue about nonsense in the very years where Tolkien was writing, and there was Joyce writing the Ulysses, and we know the old Finnegan's Wake, and we know that Tolkien read Joyce and he loved Joyce because he was doing nonsense. So in a way, there is something that Tolkien liked of all that, but there is of course a difference, and the difference is that I think for Tolkien, Derrida, Joyce stopped, did not travel the whole journey, and that's I think the whole point, and that's why Tolkien is so Catholic and so Newmanian and not Manichaean. Derrida, Joyce, all the modernists are not evil because what they're doing is bad, but because they don't go forward. Okay, they stop, and that's what evil is about. Evil is always imperfect. It's an imperfection. It's a reduction. It's a partiality of something else. And so for Tolkien, for me, is so interesting because it takes all the truth that we can even find in the experimentalism of Joyce or Derrida or whatever, but it integrates it back into a Catholic journey, which is a journey to meaning. Sorry but this is a very important point.
Thank you, Beppe. But the question I had real quick is also it's a very contemporary debate, this. When I wanted to draw your attention, there was this essay that struck me by our own colleague, Viet Nguyen, on the New York Times, if you've read it. It was precisely on this issue. Was the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. And the dichotomy that he posed in this essay was, let's give, it is not the time for craft literature that concentrates on the formal aspects and the aesthetics. This is the time to use literature as a vehicle for social change, right? So I agree with Jason. Sometimes we get recently we get a lot of bad art and didactic art, but which is sometimes, originates from the desire, for art to change reality, right? So you get kind of, the message has to come across loud and clear, so there cannot be that many nuances. So my question is, for Tolkien, how does art change reality? I mean, what role does art play in this battle of good and evil, besides what you say, awakening this desire for beauty, for the mystery, and for God, right? I mean, you still are on the journey, and this, and there is someone who has the ring of power, and is, the darkness advancing. So what, if you have something to say about this?
Yes, of course, that's the temptation of Saruman. Saruman is really this. Saruman is a temptation of a powerful art. It's the temptation to fight power with power. And Tolkien said in the aftermath of the Second World War, I only see Sarumans around. It was very, very harsh against the Americans. I mean, of course, he hated Stalin and now, but he has very strong words against the Allies, including the British government after the Second World War. Because he was horrified by the destruction of Germany. Okay, exactly for this very reason. And Tolkien was the opposite of he even refused to publish his book in Germany because he couldn't stand the Nazism. So, but he couldn't really stand the idea that you fight power with power. Power cannot be fought with power, because otherwise you will end up become a power yourself. And that's the whole point of the Lord of the Rings, what this is about. To refuse to use the ring is essentially a conflict about God. Tolkien says the Lord of the Rings is about a conflict about God. And the whole point of the ring is about this. If we are in a piece of literature, one thing is to be certain that there is an author. If you are a character within a piece of literature, and you know there is an author who has a plan, who has a plot in mind, which is strange, which involves a hobbit walking on his own into Mordor, something a bit strange. But you know that there is an author, and you're looking for the signs of the plot. You understand that the greatest artistic work you can do is to allow this plot to develop. You need to do a sort of meta-literary, meta-artistic work of allowing the plot of someone else to develop. And that's what Gandalf does. Gandalf recognizes that someone has chosen Bilbo for a purpose, and that this task has been given to Frodo, and he's really acting like a gardener. And remember, Gandalf Olori is the artist. Olori, we know it, is the artist, is a symbolic character for the art. That's what art does. So for Tolkien, the way to change the world is by allowing the seeds of good that are sprouting, Tolkien saying in another beautiful letter, in the forgotten corner of history. Because God develops his own history not in the center, not where everyone is looking at. He says in a beautiful letter, everyone is looking at Hitler and Stalin, but God is not acting that. God is acting in the forgotten corners, like the Shire. And we need to go there to the Shire and give our blood to this, and to allow these seeds to develop and to grow. And that's the way the world will change. But in order to do that, you need a great certainty. And that's why you need to be, that's why it's a conflict about God. So you need to be certain that the authority, capital A, who Tolkien likes mixing up author and authority very much, the authority, the true author, the true authority is not what you have in mind, is not what the power has in mind. And that's why Saruman falls. And that's what the Lord of the Rings is about. And paradoxically, it's only when you accept defeat, so when you accept to be defeated, it's what Gandalf does in Moria, or what Frodo does from the beginning to the very end, that you're going to win. So to accept that your heart is not changing the world, to accept your defeat is the first way to be victorious. So that's what, again, the Lord of the Rings is about.
Thanks very much, Beppe. I'll let David wrap it up. And yeah.
Thank you, Beppe. That was profound and of real value to all of us, not just what we're thinking about in our seminar, but maybe in broader meanings as well. And I love this idea that I'm going to be thinking about of letting the author complete the character's story, right? And dream it into existence. Let another's dream flourish within us. Thank you for that great presentation. And we'll talk on email about maybe we can please beg a few of those notes to share around so we can all dwell with them with a little more leisure.
So the book should be out by the end of the year if everything goes well.
Oh,
but
good.
Oh, good. Hand out of the paper today. So that's wonderful. The first step. I mean, that's the beginning of the journey, but it's a long journey into Tolkien's literary theory because it's very beautiful.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much. We'll conclude our seminar here. It's wonderful to see all of you. Stay tuned for news for our last session coming up, our 6th seminar, in which we will have Professor Jason Blakely sharing some of the fruits of his recent work on utopia and political thinking at the first part of our session. And then the second one will be with Father Greg Boyle, the Jesuit in Los Angeles, who's been instrumental in building up a new kind of community, homeboy industries that we'll be thinking about on the ground, looking for the Shire in Los Angeles, so to speak. So I will see all of you soon, I hope, and be well.